September 1st, 1943. Rabaul Airfield, New Britain. Lieutenant Commander Saburo Sakai's hand paused over the intelligence report lying on his desk in the humid operations tent. His one good eye, the other lost American gunners over Guadalcanal a year earlier, scanned the typed words that made him laugh out loud, a sound that caused the other pilots in the tent to look up from their morning briefing. "Listen to this," Sakai said to the assembled pilots of the 204th Air Group, his voice carrying the confidence of a man with 28 confirmed aerial victories. "The Americans have produced a new fighter they call a Hellcat." He paused for effect, running his finger down the specifications. "Intelligence suggests it weighs nearly 12,000 pounds fully loaded, twice our Zero. The wing is enormous, over 300 square feet. And get this, they've mounted 6 heavy machine guns on it, plus armor plating everywhere." Warrant Officer Hiroyoshi Nishizawa, Japan's rising ace with 37 kills, shook his head in disbelief. 12,000 pounds? That's heavier than our bomber aircraft. Are the Americans mounting fighter guns on transport planes now? The laughter that rippled through the tent was genuine. For 2 years, Japanese naval aviators had dominated Pacific skies with a weapon that seemed to violate the laws of physics. The Mitsubishi A6M0. Light, maneuverable, with the range of a bomber and the agility of a biplane, the Zero had destroyed every Allied fighter encountered. British Hurricanes, American P-40 Warhawks, Dutch Brewster Buffaloes, all had fallen before the Zero's superior performance. "Another American failure of design," Sakai continued, tossing the report onto his desk. "They learned nothing from their defeats. They still believe they can overcome pilot skill with weight of machinery. This Hellcat will be target practice for us." Through the tent flaps, Sakai could see his squadron Zeros lined up on the pierced steel planking, their distinctive green-gray paint scheme shimmering in the tropical heat. Sleek, beautiful, deadly. Each aircraft represented the pinnacle of Japanese aviation philosophy. Every ounce sacrifice for performance, every component stripped to its essential minimum. What Sakai didn't know, what none of the Japanese naval aviators gathering for their morning briefing could have known, was that in exactly 30 days, this failure design would begin the systematic annihilation of Japanese naval aviation. The F6F Hellcat would achieve a kill-to-loss ratio of 19-1, destroying 5,223 enemy aircraft, while losing only 270 in aerial combat. It would transform carrier warfare, break the back of Japanese air power, and prove that the Zero's reign of terror had been built on a foundation of fatal assumptions about the nature of modern air combat. The mathematics of aerial supremacy were about to be rewritten by an aircraft that looked wrong, flew heavy, and seemed to violate every principle the Japanese had perfected. Yet within 6 months, the very pilots now laughing at intelligence reports would be writing final letters home, knowing that encountering Hellcats meant statistical certainty of death. Lieutenant Toshio Oda, a veteran of the Pearl Harbor attack with 19 victories, stood up from his map table. "Commander Sakai, what are the performance specifications of this Hellcat? If we understand its limitations, we can exploit them in combat." Sakai picked up the report again, reading aloud. "Maximum speed, 375 miles per hour at sea level. Service ceiling, 37,000 feet. Rate of climb, 3,000 feet per minute. Armament, 6 Browning M250 caliber machine guns with 2,400 rounds total. Armor plating protecting pilot, oil system, and fuel tanks. Self-sealing fuel tanks holding 250 gallons. Self-sealing tanks," Warrant Officer Kinsuk Muto muttered. "More American paranoia. They build fighters like they build battleships. Layers of unnecessary protection that add weight and reduce performance." Sakai nodded in agreement. "Our philosophy is superior. The Zero achieves a performance by eliminating unnecessary weight. No armor. No self-sealing tanks. Even the radio equipment is often removed to save 30 pounds. This gives us a wing loading of 22 pounds per square foot, a turning radius of 612 feet. The Hellcat, with its wing loading of 36.5 pounds per square foot, will have a turning radius over 900 feet. In a turning fight, the basis of all fighter combat, it will be helpless." What Sakai and his fellow pilots didn't understand was that American engineers had studied captured Zeros extensively. They had tested the aircraft, documented its capabilities, and reached a profound conclusion. Don't fight the Zero's fight. The Hellcat wasn't designed to outturn the Zero. It was designed to make turning fights irrelevant. Captain Minoru Genda, the tactical genius who had planned the Pearl Harbor attack and who now served at Combined Fleet Headquarters in Truk, had reviewed the same intelligence reports. His analysis, preserved in Japanese Defense Agency archives, was dismissive in its certainty. The Americans have learned nothing from 2 years of defeats, Genda wrote in his assessment dated August 28, 1943. This Hellcat represents a continuation of their failed philosophy, attempting to overcome pilot skill with weight of machinery, armor, and firepower. American pilots lack the spiritual strength and technical proficiency of our naval aviators. They rely on material superiority because they cannot match our fighting spirit. A Zero pilot will fly circles around this overweight design. The aircraft is emblematic of American industrial thinking. More is better, regardless of performance consequences. Genda's analysis was supported by seemingly irrefutable mathematics. The Zero's extraordinary power-to-weight ratio gave it a climbing rate of 2,500 feet per minute and the ability to operate effectively at altitudes where American fighters struggled. Its wing loading allowed it to turn inside any Allied fighter then in service. Most devastatingly, its range of 1,600 miles meant it could escort bombers to targets that American fighters couldn't reach. The combat record seemed to prove Japanese superiority beyond doubt. At Pearl Harbor, 29 Japanese aircraft lost versus 347 American aircraft destroyed, a ratio of 12-1. In the Philippines, 7 losses against 103 destroyed, nearly 15-1. Over Darwin, Australia, 2 losses versus 30 destroyed, 15-1. The British Far East Fleet's air arm had been annihilated. The Dutch East Indies Air Force eliminated in days. What the Japanese didn't see was that these victories had been achieved against obsolete aircraft flown by pilots with minimal combat experience. The P-40 Warhawks, F-4F Wildcats, and Hurricane fighters that the Zero had dominated were pre-war designs already outclassed by European standards. More critically, Japanese success had created institutional blindness to a fundamental shift in American industrial and tactical thinking. The United States wasn't trying to build a better turning fighter. It was trying to make turning fights obsolete. To understand the revolution the Hellcat would bring, one must first understand the weapon it was designed to defeat. The Mitsubishi A6M0 represented the culmination of a design philosophy fundamentally different from Western approaches to fighter aircraft. In 1937, the Imperial Japanese Navy issued a specification for a carrier-based fighter that seemed impossible. A top speed of 310 miles per hour, a climb to 10,000 feet in 3.5 minutes, an endurance of 6 to 8 hours, maneuverability superior to existing fighters, an armament of 2 20mm cannon plus 2 7.7mm machine guns. Western engineers would have declared such requirements mutually exclusive. Range and maneuverability were traditionally inversions. Increase one, decrease the other. Jiro Horikoshi, chief designer at Mitsubishi, approached the problem with radical thinking. If conventional materials and design philosophies couldn't meet the specifications, then conventions must be abandoned. Horikoshi's team developed extra superduralumin, a new aluminum alloy that was 30% lighter than standard aircraft aluminum while maintaining comparable strength. This material allowed the construction of an airframe that weighed just 3,700 pounds empty. But weight reduction alone wasn't enough. Horikoshi made decisions that would later prove catastrophic, but initially seemed brilliant. No armor plate would protect the pilot. Armor weighed 200 pounds and reduced performance. Fuel tanks would not be self-sealing. Self-sealing technology added 100 pounds and reduced fuel capacity. The aircraft structure itself would be minimized to the absolute limit of structural integrity. Extra strength meant extra weight. The result was an aircraft that seemed to defy physics. When the A6M2 Model 21 entered service in July 1940, it could cruise at 230 miles per hour for 1,600 miles, then engage in violent combat maneuvers that could pull 6GS without structural failure. Its turn rate was so superior to existing fighters that American pilots initially reported that the Zero could somehow turn inside its own turning radius, an aerodynamic impossibility that spoke to how thoroughly the Zero dominated turning engagements. Warrant Officer Hiroyoshi Nishizawa, who would become Japan's ace of aces with 87 confirmed victories, described flying the Zero in his diary, recovered after the war. Flying the Zero is like wearing wings. The aircraft responds to thought, not just control input. When I enter a turn, the Zero turns before I complete the stick movement. It anticipates my intentions. American planes fly like trucks, powerful but clumsy. They build fighters like they build cars. Heavy, overbuilt, wasteful. We build fighters like we forge katanas. Every element refined to its essential purpose, excess eliminated, perfection through reduction. This philosophy created an aircraft with extraordinary capabilities but hidden vulnerabilities. The Zero's lack of armor meant that a single burst from a 50 caliber machine gun could kill the pilot or ignite unprotected fuel tanks. The lightweight structure meant that high-speed dives stressed the airframe to dangerous levels. The aircraft was optimized for the type of combat Japanese doctrine emphasized, close-range turning fights where superior maneuverability allowed Japanese pilots to get onto an enemy's tail and destroy them with cannon fire. For 2 years, this approach worked devastatingly well. American pilots flying F6F Wildcats and P-40 Warhawks learned quickly that trying to turn with Zero was suicide. The Zero would turn inside them, get onto their tail, and destroy them. American pilots who survived their first encounters with Zeros reported feeling helpless. Every maneuver they attempted, the Zero countered with superior performance. Lieutenant Commander John S. Jimmy Thatch, commanding officer VF, 3 flying F6F Wildcats from USS Yorktown, developed a Thatch weave tactic specifically to counter the Zero's superiority. 2 Wildcats would fly in a weaving pattern, each watching the other's tail. When a Zero attacked one Wildcat, the other would turn toward it, forcing the Zero to break off or face a head-on attack. It was a defensive tactic born of desperation, an admission that American fighters couldn't beat Zeros in individual combat. By mid-1943, the Japanese Navy's carrier-based fighter arm had achieved a level of elite proficiency that rivaled any air force in history. Pilots like Sakai Nishizawa, Saburo Endo, and Tetsuzo Wamoto had dozens of victories each. They refined their tactics through hundreds of combat missions. They flew an aircraft they understood intimately and trusted completely. The Imperial Japanese Navy's pilot training program had been the world's most demanding. Training took 3 years, with pilots entering combat with 700 flight hours, twice what American or British pilots received. The curriculum emphasized not just flying skills, but the spiritual dimension of combat. Pilots studied Bushido philosophy, learned to accept death with equanimity, and developed an aggressive fighting spirit that prioritized attack over defense. This combination, superior aircraft, superior pilots, superior fighting spirit, had created what Japanese naval aviation believed was an unbeatable combat system. The Americans could produce more aircraft, but they couldn't produce better aircraft or better pilots. Material quantity couldn't overcome qualitative superiority. This belief was about to collide with an American industrial and tactical revolution that the Japanese couldn't comprehend because it operated on principles foreign to their military philosophy. The F6F Hellcat's development began not in glory but in crisis. After the devastating losses at Pearl Harbor and the desperate battles of 1942, the United States Navy faced a stark reality. Its current fighters were inadequate. The F6F Wildcat, while rugged and flown by increasingly skilled pilots, was simply outperformed by the Zero. The F4U Corsair, a promising design with exceptional performance, was proving too difficult for carrier operations. Its long nose obscured forward visibility during landing, and its stiff landing gear caused dangerous bounce on carrier decks. The Navy needed a fighter that could be produced quickly, operated safely from carriers, and, most critically, defeat the Zero in combat. Grumman Aircraft Engineering Corporation, which had built the Wildcat, began work on its successor in June 1941, even before Pearl Harbor proved the urgency of the requirement. Leroy Grumman, the company's founder and chief engineer, approached the problem with characteristically pragmatic American engineering philosophy. We're not trying to build the fastest fighter or the most maneuverable fighter. he told his design team. "We're trying to build a fighter that wins." This distinction would prove crucial. The design team studied every report from combat zones. They debriefed surviving Wildcat pilots. They examined the captured Zero that crash-landed in Aleutians in June 1942, giving American engineers their first detailed look at their enemy. The conclusions they reached were revolutionary. First, trying to outturn the Zero was futile. The Zero's wing loading and power-to-weight ratio gave it an inherent advantage in turning fights. American fighters needed to avoid turning engagements entirely. Second, the Zero's lightweight construction made it vulnerable to damage. Heavy machine gun fire that an armored American fighter could absorb would destroy a Zero. If American fighters could bring their guns to bear, they could kill Zeros efficiently. Third, American pilots needed to survive being shot. Armor plate, self-sealing tanks, and robust construction weren't unnecessary weight. They were force multipliers that kept experienced pilots alive to fight again. Fourth, coordinated tactics supported by technology could overcome individual aircraft performance. Shipboard radar could vector fighters to optimal attack positions. Radio communications could coordinate attacks. If American fighters could choose when and where to engage, they could negate the Zero's advantages. The F6F Hellcat that emerged from these conclusions looked nothing like the Zero. Where the Zero was refined and minimal, the Hellcat was robust and purposeful. Its Pratt & Whitney R 2800 double wasp engine produced 2,000 horsepower, 700 more than the Zero's Nakajima Sakai engine. This power compensated for the Hellcat's greater weight, giving it comparable speed and superior climbing ability at high altitudes. The Hellcat's armor protection was comprehensive. 212 pounds of armor plate protecting the pilot from the front, sides, and rear. 110 pounds protecting the oil cooler and oil tank. Bulletproof glass windscreen capable of stopping 20mm cannon shells. The fuel system included self-sealing tanks and ACO2 fire suppression system. The airframe was stressed for 13 GS, far beyond what any pilot could withstand, ensuring the aircraft would never break apart in combat maneuvers. The armament was overwhelming by Japanese standards. 6 Browning M250 caliber machine guns, each firing 750 rounds per minute, for a combined rate of fire of 4,500 rounds per minute. Each 50 caliber bullet weighed 46 grams and traveled at 2,900 feet per second, delivering 3,500 foot-pounds of energy on impact. A 2-second burst put 150 rounds into the target, enough to destroy any aircraft ever built. When Japanese intelligence officers compiled their report on the Hellcat in August 1943, they saw only the drawbacks: excessive weight, high wing loading, draggy radial engine. They missed the revolutionary integration of design elements that made the Hellcat not just an aircraft, but a weapon system. The Hellcat included features that seemed minor, but proved transformative. The cockpit was spacious and well-organized, reducing pilot fatigue on long missions. The canopy provided exceptional visibility, allowing pilots to spot enemies before being spotted. The controls were responsive but not twitchy, allowing precise gunnery. The landing gear was robust and forgiving, making carrier landing safer for less experienced pilots. Most crucially, the Hellcat was designed from the beginning for mass production. Grumman's engineers created an aircraft with interchangeable parts, simple assembly procedures, and minimal need for skilled craftsmen. The Bethpage, New York factory could produce one Hellcat every hour at peak production. By contrast, the Zero required hand-fitting of many components, with no two aircraft exactly alike. When the first production F6F-3 rolled off the assembly line on October 3, 1942, it represented not just a new aircraft, but a new philosophy of air combat. The Japanese were about to discover that their perfected art of aerial combat had become obsolete overnight. September 30th, 1943. Marcus Island, 1,150 miles northwest of Wake Island. Petty Officer First Class Yoshio Fukui was flying escort for a reconnaissance mission when he spotted them. 6 dark blue shapes climbing from the southeast, their distinctive profiles catching the afternoon sun. His first thought, recorded in his after-action report: 25 bombers on an unusual heading. Why would medium bombers operate this far from any known base? Then they turned toward his formation, and Fukui saw the distinctive silhouette that matched the intelligence briefings. Single engine, massive fuselage, wings that seemed too short for the body, the characteristic bubble canopy. The Hellcat. All 6 aircraft were Hellcats. First encounter with F6F type fighter. Fukui would write in his report, initial impression, Americans have mounted fighter guns on a torpedo bomber. Engage with standard tactics, expecting easy victory. Standard tactics meant exploiting the Zero's superior turn rate. Fukui rolled into a diving turn, pulling 5 GS, confident that the heavy American fighter would be unable to follow. Every combat engagement for 2 years had followed this pattern. Enter a turning fight, use superior maneuverability to get onto the enemy's tail, destroy them with cannon fire. What happened next violated everything Fukui understood about air combat. The Hellcat didn't try to turn with him. Instead, the American pilot executed a maneuver that shouldn't have been possible for an aircraft weighing 12,000 pounds. A vertical climb at full power. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine, producing 2,000 horsepower, drove the Hellcat upward at 3,500 feet per minute. Fukui, attempting to follow in a Zero, watched helplessly as his airspeed decayed. At 15,000 feet, his Zero was struggling, the Nakajima Sakai engine laboring in the thin air. The Hellcat was still climbing strongly. At 18,000 feet, the Hellcat performed a hammerhead turn, a vertical stall followed by a pivot on the vertical axis that dropped it directly onto Fukui's tail. The American pilot opened fire at 400 meters. 6 machine guns, not the 4 we expected. Fukui reported, the volume of fire was unprecedented. Tracers appeared as a solid stream of light. My aircraft took 17 hits in 3 seconds. Port wing punctured in 4 places. Rudder controls damaged. Fuselage penetrated aft of cockpit. Only by entering a spin and falling 4,000 feet did I escape destruction. Fukui survived, barely making it back to Marcus Island with his Zero riddled with holes, control surfaces shredded, and fuel streaming from punctured tanks. His wingman, Petty Officer Second Class Tetsuo Matsuda, didn't return. Neither did the reconnaissance aircraft they were escorting. The American pilot who shot down Matsuda was Ensign Richard Batten of VF-6 from USS Independence. His after-action report, preserved in U.S. Navy archives, describes the engagement from the American perspective. Encountered 2 Zero fighters at 12,000 feet. Executing energy tactics as trained, I applied full power and climbed vertically. The enemy attempted to follow, but stalled at approximately 15,000 feet. Performed hammerhead turn, acquired target and gun sight. Opened fire at 400 yards with 6-gun burst. Observed strikes along enemy fuselage and wing route. Enemy aircraft began smoking, entered spin. Followed at 8,000 feet, observing enemy pilot bailout. Parachute deployed successfully. Returned to CAP station. The engagement had lasted less than 3 minutes from first contact to Matsuda's death. The Hellcat pilot had never allowed the Zero to use its superior turning ability. He had fought a vertical battle, climbs and dives, with a Hellcat's superior power-to-weight ratio at altitude gave it control of the engagement. This was the combat method that American tacticians had developed. Energy fighting. Instead of trying to outturn the enemy, maintain superior energy through speed and altitude. Attack from advantageous positions. Use superior firepower damage or destroy the enemy quickly, then climb away before they can respond. Refuse to fight on the enemy's terms. For the Zero pilots, this was incomprehensible. Combat meant getting close, engaging in a turning fight, using superior skill and aircraft performance to maneuver onto the enemy's tail. The Americans were refusing to fight. Properly, they were running away. Except when they attacked, they killed efficiently and escaped before the Zero could respond. Back at Marcus Island, Fukui's report made its way up the command chain. Squadron commanders read it with concern, but not alarm. One engagement proved nothing. Perhaps this American pilot was unusually skilled. Perhaps Fukui and Matsuda had made tactical errors. The Hellcat apparent performance in vertical maneuvers was noted but not yet understood as representing a fundamental shift in combat doctrine. That understanding would come quickly, and it would come a body count that shocked the Japanese Naval Command structure. October 5th, 1943. Task Force 14 struck Wake Island as part of an ongoing campaign to suppress Japanese air power in the Central Pacific. The Americans committed 4 fleet carriers, USS Lexington, USS Yorktown, USS Cowpens, and USS Independence, carrying a combined air group that included 72 F6F Hellcats. Lieutenant Yoshio Shiga led 12 Zeros from the 252nd Air Group to intercept what appeared to be another American nuisance raid. American carriers have been launching these hit-and-run attacks for months, usually fleeing before Japanese fighters could fully engage. The pattern was predictable. American bombers would attack, fighters would provide close escort, and both would retire toward their carriers as soon as Japanese fighters appeared. Shiga planned a textbook interception. His formation would climb to 20,000 feet, position themselves with altitude and sun advantage, then dive on the American formation. The Americans would break formation trying to escape, and the Zeros would chase them down individually. It was a tactic that had worked countless times. "We climbed to 20,000 feet, Shiga recorded in his diary. Below us, 12 F6F fighters and 3 divisions of 4 aircraft each. We held every advantage, altitude, position, surprise. Our numbers were equal. Victory was certain. The dive began at 0947 hours. 12 Zeros, engines at maximum power, plunging from 20,000 feet toward the American formation at 15,000 feet. Shiga Zero reached 350 miles per hour in the dive, approaching the maximum speed the lightweight airframe could handle. At this speed, the Zero became difficult to control. The aileron stiffened. The rudder became sluggish. The aircraft wanted to continue straight regardless of control input. The American formation didn't scatter. The Hellcats maintained tight formation, accelerating in a gentle dive that kept their speed below the point where control became difficult. When the Zeros opened fire at maximum range, hoping for lucky hits, something unexpected happened. The Hellcats simply absorbed the damage. 20mm cannon shells from the Zero's nose-mounted Type 99 cannon struck Hellcat fuselages, wings, and engines. Rounds that would have torn apart a Zero's unprotected structure punched holes in the Hellcat armor and self-sealing tanks. But the aircraft continued flying. The robust construction and armor components that Japanese intelligence had dismissed as unnecessary weight proved to be the difference between damaged aircraft and destroyed aircraft. As the Zeros exhausted their energy in the diving attack, passing through the American formation without achieving any kills, the Hellcats executed their counterattack. Rather than turning to dogfight, which would have given the Zeros their preferred combat, the Hellcats used their superior power at altitude to climb. They came back at us like hawks on sparrows, Shiga wrote. Their weight, which we thought was weakness, became their weapon. At 25,000 feet, they were still climbing strongly. Our Zeros were struggling, engines gasping in the thin air. The Hellcat's engine produced full power at altitudes where ours were starved for oxygen. The R-2800 engine's 2-stage supercharger maintained sea-level power output up to 21,000 feet. At 25,000 feet, it was still producing 1,650 horsepower. The Nakajima Sakai engine, with its single-stage supercharger, was producing only 900 horsepower at that altitude, barely enough to maintain level flight while maneuvering. The Hellcats dove on the Zeros from above, converting altitude into speed. They would dive, fire a 2-second burst from 650 caliber machine guns, then zoom climb back to altitude before the Zeros could respond. The Zeros, unable to match the Hellcats' vertical performance, could only attempt to turn into the attacks, but turning bled energy, making them even more vulnerable to the next attack. It was systematic execution, Shiga wrote. They would dive, fire those 6 terrible guns, then climb away before we could bring our weapons to bear. We tried turning into them, but turning at altitude made us nearly stationary. They would simply wait until we lost speed, then attack again. 8 Zeros were shot down in 15 minutes. We never scored a single hit on a Hellcat. The mathematics of the engagement revealed the Hellcat's revolutionary effectiveness. 8 Zeros destroyed for 0 Hellcat losses. More significantly, the Hellcats had achieved this while outnumbered and starting from a disadvantageous position. The American pilots had refused to fight the Zero's fight. They had imposed their own combat method, and the result was one-sided slaughter. Lieutenant Junior Grade Alexander Vrashu, flying from USS Independence, shot down 3 Zeros in this engagement. His after-action report described the tactical method. Observed enemy aircraft diving on our formation from 20,000 feet. Maintained formation discipline. Absorbed initial attack without braking. Enemy passed through our formation, losing speed. Applied full military power. Climbed to 23,000 feet. Enemy aircraft attempting to climb, but visibly struggling at altitude. Selected target. Dove from 23,000 to 18,000 feet. Opened fire at 300 yards with 3-second burst. Observed strikes on enemy wing and fuselage. Enemy aircraft caught fire, entered flat spin. Climbed back to 24,000 feet. Repeated twice more with identical results. Total ammunition expenditure. 1,200 rounds for 3 kills. Enemy never achieved firing position on me or any aircraft in my division. The engagement revealed several profound truths that Japanese commanders were slow to acknowledge. First, the Hellcat's excessive weight was actually optimal weight for modern air combat. The armor and robust construction allowed Hellcat pilots to survive damage that killed Zero pilots. This meant experienced Hellcat pilots remained in combat, accumulating skill and tactical knowledge. Zero pilots who survived being hit once were usually dead the second time. Second, the Hellcat 650 caliber machine guns produced overwhelming firepower. A 2-second burst put 150 rounds on target. Even if only 10% achieved direct hits, that was 1550 caliber rounds impacting a Zero, more than enough to destroy the lightly built aircraft. The Zero's 2 20mm cannons and 2 7.7mm machine guns couldn't match this volume of fire. Third, and most devastating, the Hellcat's tactical doctrine, energy fighting rather than turning combat, neutralized the Zero's primary advantage. The Americans had changed the fundamental nature of fighter combat, and the Zero was optimized for a type of combat that no longer mattered. Japanese fighter tactics had been developed over years of combat experience and were based on the turning fight. Get onto the enemy's tail through superior maneuverability, maintain the tail position, destroy the enemy. Every element of Zero design and pilot training supported this tactical method. The Americans had made the turning fight obsolete. The Hellcat's doctrine was maintain energy through speed and altitude, attack from advantageous positions, destroy quickly with overwhelming firepower, escape before counterattack. Never let the enemy impose his preferred combat method. For the Zero pilots, this felt like cowardice. The Americans wouldn't stand and fight. They hit and ran, using altitude and speed to escape before the Zero could force them into a proper dogfight. But the kill-to-loss ratios told a different story. The Americans weren't avoiding combat out of fear. They were choosing when and how to fight, and winning decisively every time. November 11, 1943. Rabaul, New Britain. The assembled pilots of the 204th Air Group listened in grim silence as Lieutenant Commander Tadao Tanamizu briefed them on American tactics. Tanamizu, with 32 confirmed victories, was one of the few pilots who had survived multiple encounters with Hellcats and lived to analyze what had gone wrong. Forget everything you know about air combat, Tanamizu told them, his voice carrying none of the confidence that had characterized Japanese fighter briefings earlier in the war. The Americans have changed the rules. They no longer fight our fight. They fight like executioners, not warriors. Tanamizu explained what Japanese pilots were slowly, painfully learning. The Hellcat wasn't designed to outturn the Zero. It was designed to never need to turn. They work in pairs. Tanamizu continued, using a blackboard to diagram the tactic. One Hellcat flies high, one flies low. When you engage the low one, the high one is already diving on you. They're radios, which we laughed at for adding weight. Let them coordinate perfectly. While you're focused on one target, his wingman is lining up on you from your blind spot. He drew another diagram. They maintain what they call energy through speed and altitude. When they attack, they dive from above, fire, then climb back to altitude. They never slow down. They never turn with you. And their 6 guns kill with a burst that lasts only 2 seconds. Petty Officer Takeo Tenemizu, no relation to the briefing officer, raised his hand. Commander, if they refuse to engage in turning combat, why don't we simply attack their bombers? They must defend the bombers, and that will force them to fight our way. Tenemizu shook his head. That's exactly what they want. When we attack their bombers, the Hellcats dive on us from above. We must choose. Continue attacking the bombers and be destroyed by the fighters, or turn into the fighters and abandon our attack on the bombers. Either way, they dictate the combat. He paused, making eye contact with each pilot in the room. The worst part is their radar. They have radar on their ships that can see us from 50 miles away. They vector their fighters to perfect intercept positions. We arrive at the target expecting to achieve surprise, but they're already at altitude, positioned with the sun at their backs, waiting for us. We're fighting blind men against those who can see. The technology gap that Tenemizu described went beyond just radar and radios. The Americans had integrated their weapons into a system where each component supported the others. Shipboard radar detected incoming raids. Fighter direction officers on the ships analyzed the radar data and vectored fighters to optimal intercept positions. Radio communications allowed instant coordination between fighter divisions. The Hellcat performance allowed it to execute the tactics the system enabled. The Japanese had no equivalent system. Their radar technology was years behind American radar. Their radio equipment was unreliable and often removed to save weight. Their fighter doctrine assumed visual contact and individual initiative. They were fighting a 1940s war with 1930s technology and tactics. I must be honest with you, Tenemizu concluded. Every pilot who has fought Hellcats and survived has done so because the American pilot made an error or ran out of ammunition, not because we outfought them. The Hellcat is not superior to Zero in any single performance metric, but the Americans have integrated their aircraft into a system that makes our advantages irrelevant. The briefing room remained silent after Tenemizu finished. Finally, Commander Sakai spoke. Then how do we fight them? Tenemizu's answer was devastating in its honesty. I don't know. Every tactic we've tried has failed. If we maintain altitude, they stay above us and dive when we commit to attacking. If we climb to meet them, we waste fuel and arrive at our targets with empty tanks. If we turn to fight them, they refuse to turn and simply extend away using superior speed. Then they come back from a different angle, while we're low and slow. He gestured at the blackboard. The only successes we've had were against damaged Hellcats that couldn't climb away, or against American pilots who made the mistake of trying to turn fight with us. But even those victories cost us heavily, usually 2 or 3 zeros to destroy one Hellcat. December 1943. Truck Lagoon, Caroline Islands. Commander Mitsuo Fukuda, who had led the Pearl Harbor attack and now served as Air Operations Officer for Combined Fleet, inspected damaged Zeros returning from encounters with Hellcats. What he found confirmed his growing fears about the technology gap opening between Japanese and American aviation. The disparity in firepower was mathematical and undeniable. The Hellcat 6 Browning M250 caliber machine guns fired 750 rounds per minute each, 4,500 rounds per minute total. Each 50 caliber bullet weighed 46 grams and traveled at 2,900 feet per second, delivering 3,500 foot-pounds of kinetic energy on impact. The Zero's armament consisted of 2 Type 99 20mm cannons with 60 rounds per gun, firing at 520 rounds per minute, and 2 Type 97 7.7mm machine guns with 680 rounds per gun, firing at 900 rounds per minute. While the 20mm cannons hit harder per round, they had limited ammunition and a low rate of fire. A Zero pilot who fired all his ammunition in continuous bursts would be empty in 23 seconds. A Hellcat pilot could fire continuously for 32 seconds. More significantly, the 50 caliber machine guns had much higher hit probability. The 6 guns converged at 300 yards, creating a cone of fire where multiple gun trajectories overlapped. At that range, even a mediocre pilot could put dozens of rounds on target. The Zero's 2 cannons mounted in the wings had to be carefully aimed to hit. Their trajectories only converged in a small area at a specific range. But the technology gap extended far beyond just firepower. Fukuda's inspection revealed structural damage patterns that terrified him. Zeros were returning with catastrophic battle damage that should have been fatal, but somehow the pilots had survived long enough to make it home. One Zero had taken 14 50 caliber hits through the fuselage. The rounds had penetrated the thin aluminum skin, passed completely through the aircraft, and exited the other side. 2 rounds had passed within inches of the pilot. One had severed the control cables for the rudder. Another had punctured the main fuel tank. The aircraft had made it back to base only because the pilot had exceptional skill and extraordinary luck. This is what happens when we eliminate armor to save weight. Fukuda wrote in his report to Combined Fleet Headquarters. American pilots flying Hellcats routinely survive this level of damage. They have armor plate protecting vital components. Their fuel tanks seal themselves when punctured. Their robust structure can absorb battle damage that would destroy a Zero. They can make mistakes, take hits, and survive to learn from the experience. Our pilots must be perfect every time, or they die. The most disturbing reports concerned American radar-guided fighter direction. Lieutenant Sadamu Kamachi described his first experience with this technology in his action report from November 18, 1943. We were climbing through clouds at 12,000 feet when they hit us. No warning, no visual contact until the last moment. Hellcats diving from above, exactly on our heading, perfectly positioned to intercept us. They knew where we were, our altitude, our course, our speed. It was as if they could see through the clouds. We were blind men fighting those who could see in the dark. The tactical implications were profound. Japanese fighters had to rely on visual sighting to locate enemy aircraft. In clear weather, good pilots could spot enemies at 5 to 10 miles. In clouds or haze, visual detection dropped to a few hundred yards. American radar could detect aircraft at 50 miles, through any weather, day or night. The Americans always knew where Japanese aircraft were. The Japanese rarely knew where Americans were until they started shooting. Fukuda summarized the problem in his December 15, 1943 report. We face an enemy who can see us before we see them, coordinate their attacks with instant communications, engage us with aircraft that match or exceed our performance at all altitudes, kill us with overwhelming firepower, and survive damage that kills our pilots. We are fighting with the tactical and technological systems of 1941 against an enemy that has evolved to 1944. Unless we close this gap, we will be systematically destroyed. The report reached Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet, who read it with growing alarm. Yamamoto had opposed war with America from beginning, warning that Japan might win victories for 6 months to a year, but couldn't win a protracted war against American industrial capacity. Now his fears were being realized. The Americans had not only matched Japanese aircraft quality, but were producing them in overwhelming numbers. In 1943, Japan produced 16,700 aircraft of all types. The United States produced 85,000. The quality gap was closing, and the quantity gap was insurmountable. January 1944. The Japanese pilot crisis was becoming catastrophic, and it directly impacted their ability to counter the Hellcat threat. The pre-war Imperial Japanese Navy pilot training program had been the world's most demanding. Training took 3 full years, with pilots entering combat with 700 flight hours. The curriculum was comprehensive. Basic flight training, advanced aerobatics, formation flying, navigation, gunnery, night operations, and carrier qualifications. Candidates were selected from thousands of applicants, and the washout rate exceeded 60%. Those who completed training were among the world's best pilots. This system had produced the superb aviators who dominated 1941 and 1942. But it had a fatal flaw. It couldn't replace losses quickly. When experienced pilots were killed, it took 3 years to train replacements. And the Americans were killing experienced Japanese pilots faster than they could be replaced. By early 1944, the crisis had reached emergency levels. Japanese naval pilots were entering combat with only 300 flight hours, less than half the pre-war standard. Army pilots received 200 hours or less. Fuel shortages meant most training was done in gliders or with engines throttled back to save fuel. Gunnery practice was limited to 50 rounds per pilot. barely enough to learn how to operate the gun sight, let alone develop proficiency. Formation flying, which required extensive practice to perfect, was abbreviated or eliminated. Instrument flying, essential for operating in bad weather or at night, received minimal training. Radio procedure, never a Japanese strong point, was barely taught. The result was pilots who could take off and land, fly in formation on clear days and fire their guns, but who lacked the depth of training that produced combat effectiveness. Lieutenant Commander Yoshihiro Hashimoto, training officer at Kasimagara Naval Air Station, wrote in his June 1944 report, "We are sending children to fight professionals." Yesterday, Ensign Yamamoto arrived at the front with 180 flight hours. He had never fired his guns in flight. We have no ammunition for practice. He had never flown at night. We have no fuel for such training. He had never experienced combat maneuvering at high G-loads. We cannot risk damaging training aircraft. He lasted 7 minutes in his first combat mission against Hellcats. The contrast with American pilot training was stark. By 1944, American Navy pilots received a minimum of 300 flight hours before assignment to fleet squadrons, then typically 50 to 100 additional hours in the squadron before entering combat. They had fired thousands of practice rounds, learning deflection, shooting, and gunnery techniques. They had practiced carrier landings until the procedures were automatic. They had flown formation in all weather conditions. They had learned energy tactics and safety over Texas and Florida, not under fire over the Pacific. Most crucially, American pilots who survived their first few combat missions accumulated experience that made them increasingly effective. A pilot who flew 30 missions had seen every situation multiple times. He knew how to position for attacks, how to evade enemy fire, how to coordinate with wingmen. He was a professional warrior, and he flew an aircraft designed to keep him alive long enough to become one. Japanese pilots, by contrast, rarely survived long enough to gain experience. The combination of inadequate training, inferior tactics, and unarmored aircraft meant that most new Japanese pilots died in their first 5 combat missions. The few who survived became increasingly valuable and increasingly exhausted. Veteran pilots were flying mission after mission with minimal rest, trying to compensate for the poor training of new pilots. Warrant Officer Hiroyoshi Nishizawa, Japan's ace of aces, flew 256 combat missions between 1942 and 1944. By mid-1944, he was showing signs of severe combat fatigue, weight loss, insomnia, hand tremors, difficulty concentrating. He continued flying because there was no one else with his level of skill and experience. The mathematics of attrition were inexorable. Japan started the war with approximately 3,500 trained naval aviators. By January 1944, fewer than 300 of these pre-war pilots remained alive. The rest had been killed in combat or accidents. They had been replaced by pilots with 1/3 the training, fly against an enemy whose pilot quality was improving and whose aircraft were becoming more capable. When these inexperienced Japanese pilots encountered Hellcats flown by American veterans, the results were predictable. Japanese formation discipline broke down under attack. Pilots made basic errors, turning the wrong direction, losing sight of their wingmen, fixating on one target while another attacked them from behind. They tried to use the Zero's turning advantage, not realizing that Hellcat pilots would simply refuse to turn and kill them with slashing attacks from altitude. Commander David McCampbell, who had become the Navy's top ace with 34 victories, described fighting inexperienced Japanese pilots in his memoir. By mid-1944, we were encountering Japanese formations where maybe 1 or 2 pilots showed skill and tactical awareness. The rest were targets. They would try to turn fight us, not understanding that we would never enter a turning engagement. We'd make a high side pass, shoot one down, zoom climb back to altitude, and repeat. They couldn't adapt. They kept trying to fight the way they'd been taught, and that way no longer worked. The Japanese pilot shortage became so acute that by late 1944, some pilots were entering combat with as few as 40 to 50 hours of training. These pilots, barely qualified to fly solo, were expected to fight in combat against American aviators flying superior aircraft using superior tactics. The outcome was never in doubt. June 19, 1944. The Philippine Sea. Admiral Saburo Sakai committed Japan's reconstituted carrier force to Operation Ego, the decisive battle that would destroy American carrier power in the Pacific and turn the tide of the war. 9 carriers embarked 450 aircraft, including 222 Zeros and their improved variants. Against them, Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher's Task Force 58 deployed 15 carriers with 956 aircraft, including 450 F6F Hellcats. The Japanese plan relied on several advantages. First, their aircraft had greater range. They could attack the Americans before American aircraft could reach them. Second, they could shuttle bomb, attack the American fleet, then land at Guam or Rota to refuel and rearm before returning to their carriers. Third, land-based aircraft from the Marianas would coordinate with the carrier strikes, overwhelming American defenses with sheer numbers. What Ozawa didn't know was that American submarines had already detected his fleet, giving Mitcher precise information on Japanese positions and intentions. More critically, the land-based aircraft that were supposed to support the attack had been largely destroyed by American carrier raids in the days before the battle. And Task Force 58's 450 Hellcats, directed by radar and controlled by fighter direction officers using proven tactics, were about to demonstrate the complete obsolescence of Japanese naval aviation. The first wave of 69 Japanese aircraft launched at 0830 on June 19th. American radar detected them at 150 miles. Commander David McCampbell, Air Group Commander on USS Essex, later described the American response. We had perfect information. Radar told us exactly where they were, what altitude, what heading, how many aircraft. Fighter direction vectored us to intercept positions. We climbed to altitude, positioned ourselves with the sun at our backs, and waited for them to arrive. They were completely surprised. They thought they were attacking from an unexpected direction, but we were already there at altitude with energy advantage, perfectly positioned. The engagement that followed will be studied in naval academies for decades as the perfect execution of coordinated air defense. Lieutenant Zenji Abe, leading the fighter escort for the first wave, saw the Hellcats minutes before contact. His radio transmission, intercepted and translated by American intelligence, captured his shock. They are waiting for us. At least 60 fighters, altitude 25,000 feet, positioned across our approach. We are at 18,000 feet. They hold every advantage. The American attack was methodical and devastating. Hellcats dove in divisions of 4, making high side passes with their 6 guns blazing. The Japanese formation, already stressed by the long overwater flight, shattered under the assault. Zeros tried to turn into the attacks, but turning bled their energy, making them slow and vulnerable. The Hellcats would fire, zoom climb back to altitude, reset their attack position, and dive again. Of the 69 aircraft in the first Japanese wave, 42 were shot down. Only 6 bombers managed to reach the American fleet, and they achieved no hits. The escort Zeros had been annihilated, with not a single confirmed victory against the Hellcats. The second wave, launched at 0900, consisted of 129 aircraft. Radar detected them at 0939, 115 miles out. Again, Hellcats were vectored to perfect intercept positions. Again, the slaughter was systematic. 97 Japanese aircraft were destroyed for the loss of 3 Hellcats. The third wave of 47 aircraft launched at 1000. American radar operators detected them, but a communication error resulted in no fighters being vectored to intercept. The Japanese formation reached the American fleet, where they encountered something they hadn't expected. Hellcat on combat air patrol directly over the carriers. Lieutenant Alexander Vrashu, flying CAP from USS Lexington, spotted the incoming raid at 25,000 feet. "I've never seen so many aircraft in one place," he radioed. "It's like an aluminum cloud." Vrashu and his wingman dove into the formation. In 8 minutes, Vrashu shot down 6 enemy aircraft, all dive bombers, expending only 360 rounds. His gun camera footage shows the clinical efficiency of the Hellcat as a weapons platform. Dive to achieve perfect deflection angle, 2-second burst. Enemy aircraft explodes or catches fire. Climb back to altitude. Acquire next target. Of the third wave's 47 aircraft, Only 7 returned to their carriers. The Americans lost 6 Hellcats. The fourth wave, consisting of 82 aircraft, was detected at 11:30. Only 9 aircraft made it through the defending Hellcats to attack the American fleet. They achieved no hits. 73 Japanese aircraft were shot down. By day's end, the totals were catastrophic for Japan. Japanese aircraft losses: 346 carrier aircraft destroyed, plus approximately 50 land-based aircraft destroyed in related actions. American aircraft losses: 30 total, from all causes, including operational accidents. The kill ratio for the day was approximately 12-1 in favor of the Americans. For Hellcats specifically, the ratio was closer to 19-1, their overall war average. But the numbers, stark as they were, didn't capture the completeness of the defeat. Japan had committed its carefully reconstituted carrier air groups. The replacement pilots trained over 18 months to restore carrier capability. They were gone. Japanese naval aviation would never recover from this single day of combat. American pilots coined the term Marianas Turkey Shoot to describe the battle. The enemy aircraft had been as helpless as game birds. Commander Paul Buey, who shot down 6 aircraft that day, described it simply: it wasn't a battle, it was an execution. They came at us in formations we could see for miles. We had altitude, speed, position, and overwhelming firepower. They never had a chance. Admiral Ozawa, watching from his flagship as his air groups were annihilated, sent a message to Combined Fleet Headquarters. Enemy fighter direction has achieved what we thought impossible: the industrialization of air combat. Each Hellcat is not an individual fighter, but a component in a vast machine. Our pilots, no matter how skilled, are engaging not planes but system. Recommend immediate reconsideration of all tactical doctrine. The recommendation came too late. Japanese naval aviation had been broken as an effective combat force. The survivors of June 19th would fight on for another 14 months, but they would never again threaten American naval supremacy. The Hellcat had done what the Zero had failed to do. It had achieved sustainable dominance through the integration of superior technology, tactics, and industrial production. October 25th, 1944. The Battle of Leyte Gulf, Philippines. The transformation of Japanese naval aviation from an elite striking force to kamikaze operations represented the ultimate admission of Hellcat superiority. Unable to compete conventionally against the American fighter defenses, Japan turned its pilots into guided missiles. Vice Admiral Takejiro Nishi, father of the kamikaze program, justified it with stark mathematics in his October 19th, 1944 briefing to pilots selected for the first official kamikaze unit. If a Zero attacks an American carrier conventionally, the probability of success is near zero. American Hellcats will intercept you before you reach the target. If you penetrate their combat air patrol, their anti-aircraft fire will destroy you. And if your bomb or torpedo hits, one hit will not sink a fleet carrier. You will die and achieve nothing. He paused, letting the grim reality sink in. If the Zero becomes a bomb, if you crash your aircraft into the carrier, the probability of causing damage increases to approximately 30%. The pilot dies either way. But as a kamikaze, your death has meaning. One aircraft crashing into a carrier's flight deck can render it inoperable. 5 aircraft might sink it. The mathematics, while brutal, reflected the reality Japanese pilots faced by late 1944. Conventional attacks against American fleet carriers protected by Hellcat CAP had become suicide missions with near-zero probability of success. The Hellcats would intercept the attackers at distance, using radar guidance of position perfectly. The Japanese pilots, exhausted from long over-water flights, low on fuel, would find themselves attacked from altitude by fighters they couldn't evade. Those who survived to reach the fleet would face massed anti-aircraft fire from dozens of ships. On October 25th, Lieutenant Yukio Seiki led the first official kamikaze mission. 5 Zero fighters loaded with 250-kilogram bombs, aiming for escort carriers of Task Group 77.4. Warrant Officer Hiroyoshi Nishizawa, Japan's ace of aces, flew escort for this mission. It would be his last combat flight before his own death the following day. Nishizawa's after-action report, one of his final writings, described the mission with barely suppressed anguish. We escorted 5 brave warriors on their final flight. American Hellcats intercepted us 50 miles from the target. I engaged them to draw them away from the kamikaze aircraft. I shot down 2 Hellcats, but could not prevent others from attacking our special attack planes. 1 kamikaze aircraft was shot down before reaching the fleet. The remaining 4 penetrated the defenses. Nishizawa claimed his 86 and 87 victories in this engagement, 2 F6F Hellcats from VF-27. But the tactical situation revealed how completely the Hellcat had achieved dominance. Japan's greatest ace, in his final combat mission, could barely protect slower kamikaze aircraft long enough for them to reach targets. His Zero could still win individual combats against Hellcats if he used every bit of skill and experience. But there were too many Hellcats. They were too well-coordinated, and they could afford to trade losses. Japan could not. The next day, October 26, 1944, Hiroyoshi Nishizawa died as a passenger aboard a transport aircraft shot down by Hellcats from VF-14 off Mindoro. Japan's ace of aces, helpless without a fighter, fell to the very aircraft he had briefly bested. His death symbolized the completeness of the Hellcat's victory. Even Japan's best pilot couldn't survive in an environment where Hellcats control the skies. The kamikaze campaign that followed would sink dozens of American ships and damage hundreds more, but it represented strategic defeat. An air force reduced to using its pilots as missiles had admitted it couldn't win air superiority through conventional means. The Hellcat had forced Japan to this desperation, and even kamikazes faced daunting odds against Hellcat-defended fleets. By 1945, the technological and tactical gap had become unbridgeable. The F6F Hellcat incorporated improvements that made it even deadlier. Water injection boosting power to 2,200 horsepower for emergency situations, improved armor protection, zero-length rocket launchers for ground attack missions, and a new K-14 computing gun sight that automatically calculated deflection for moving targets. The Okinawa campaign, April through June 1945, demonstrated the Hellcat's evolved role. It was no longer just a fighter, but a defender against the desperation of suicide attacks. The Japanese launched 1,900 kamikaze sorties against the American fleet off Okinawa. Hellcats flew 38,038 combat sorties in defense of the fleet, claiming 2,351 victories against 249 losses, a kill ratio of 9.5 to 1. More significantly, Hellcats prevented approximately 80% of kamikaze aircraft from reaching their targets. Those that got through faced massed anti-aircraft fire from the fleet. The combination of fighter defense and AA fire meant that kamikaze attacks, despite their desperation and the courage of the pilots, had only about a 3 to 5% success rate, far below the 30% Onishi had predicted. Lieutenant Eugene Valencia, leading his famous flying circus division of 4 Hellcats, shot down 23 Japanese aircraft during the Okinawa campaign, using tactics that represented perfection of coordinated fighter operations. Valencia's division flew in a flexible formation he called the mowing machine, for Hellcats in line abreast, separated by 100 yards, sweeping through enemy formations at high speed. Each pilot covered his sector. Valencia explained in his debriefing, "We'd make one pass through their formation, climb back to altitude, reset, and sweep through again from a different angle. They couldn't focus on any single threat, because all 4 of us were firing simultaneously from different positions. We destroyed 3 or 4 aircraft per pass. In one mission on April 17th, my division shot down 12 Japanese aircraft in 15 minutes without taking a single hit." This level of tactical sophistication, enabled by extensive training, radio communications, and an aircraft capable of executing the tactics, represented everything the Japanese couldn't match by 1945. By war's end, August 15, 1945, the F6F Hellcat's combat record told a story of complete dominance. Total enemy aircraft destroyed in aerial combat, 5,223. Hellcats lost to enemy aircraft, 270. Kill-to-loss ratio, 19.3 to 1. Navy pilots who became aces flying Hellcats, 305. Percentage of total Navy air-to-air victories, 75%. These numbers represented not just aircraft destroyed, but the systematic dismantling of an entire air force. The Imperial Japanese Navy, which had started the war with 3,500 highly trained pilots and the world's best carrier-based fighter, ended the war with fewer than 100 combat-capable pilots and aircraft they could barely keep flying due to fuel and part shortages. The human cost for Japan was even more stark. Of the approximately 18,000 naval aviators who served during the war, only about 2,000 survived to see Japan surrender. Most of those survivors had been instructors, administrative personnel, or pilots who spent the war in training units far from combat zones. The combat pilots, the men who had flown Zeros against Hellcats, had been systematically killed. Commander David McCampbell, the Navy's ace of aces with 34 victories, all but 3 in Hellcat, summarized the aircraft's impact. The Hellcat won the Pacific Air War, period. Not because it was the fastest fighter or the most maneuverable. It wasn't. It won because it was the right aircraft for the mission. It kept pilots alive. It killed efficiently. It could be produced in numbers that overwhelmed the enemy. And it was integrated into a tactical and technological system that made our advantages compounding and their advantages irrelevant. After the war, surviving Japanese pilots and commanders tried to explain how they had lost so decisively. Their reflections revealed the depth of the philosophical and technological gulf between Japanese and American approaches to air warfare. Captain Minoru Genda, who had dismissed the Hellcat as weight over finesse in August 1943, wrote a very different assessment in September 1945. We designed the Zero for the war we wanted to fight. Individual combat between skilled warriors where maneuvering ability determined victory. The Americans designed a Hellcat for the war they had to fight. Mass combat where surviving long enough to gain experience mattered more than peak performance. We built a sword. They built a machine gun. In the industrial age, the machine gun wins. Commander Saburo Sakai, who lived until 2000, provided perhaps the most honest assessment in his final interview. The Zero made Japan a great naval power. The Hellcat made Japan realize it was never as great as it believed. We thought we were samurai warriors whose spirit and skill would overcome any material disadvantage. The Hellcat showed us we were just men with outdated weapons facing the future. He paused, old eyes distant with memory. Every Japanese pilot who survived the war survived because a Hellcat pilot chose to let them live. Either by missing or by running out of ammunition, or by being ordered to break off the attack. That is the ultimate defeat, existing at your enemy's discretion. Grumman's production of the Hellcat itself became a weapon. The Bethpage, New York factory operated 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. At peak production in March 1945, a new Hellcat rolled off the assembly line every hour. Workers used color-coded instructions and sub-assemblies that could be installed in minutes. Quality control inspectors checked every aircraft, but the design was so robust that defects were rare and usually minor. The company produced 12,275 Hellcats in 30 months, an average of 409 aircraft per month. This rate of production would have seemed like fantasy to Japanese aircraft manufacturers, who struggled to produce 400 fighters per month of all types combined. Professor Jiro Horikoshi, designer of the Zero, studied the Hellcat extensively after the war. His conclusion was devastating to Japanese pride. We designed an aircraft for 1941. They designed an aircraft system for 1945. While we were perfecting the sword, they were building the industrial age. Every Hellcat part was interchangeable with every other Hellcat part. Their engines could be swapped between aircraft in 30 minutes. Their entire production system was designed for mass production with consistent quality. He paused in his analysis, then added, more humbling, they designed the Hellcat to be flown by average pilots and make them effective. We designed the Zero to be flown by exceptional pilots and make them superior. When both sides ran out of exceptional pilots, the aircraft that average pilots could fly effectively won the war. The Hellcat didn't just win battles. It revolutionized naval warfare doctrine. Pre-war thinking assumed that aircraft carriers were vulnerable platforms that needed to strike first to survive. The carrier that got its strike off first would destroy the enemy's carriers before they could launch, winning the battle. The Hellcat inverted this assumption. With strong fighter defenses directed by radar, carriers became nearly invulnerable to air attack. They no longer needed to strike first. They could wait for the enemy to attack, destroy the incoming raid, then launch their own strike against an enemy depleted of aircraft. Admiral Mark Mitcher, commander of Task Force 58, understood this transformation. With the Hellcat, we don't need to find the enemy first. Let them come. The F6F will destroy them at our convenience. Meanwhile, we'll find them with our scout aircraft and submarines, and strike when we're ready. This confidence allowed unprecedented offensive operations. Task Force 58 could park off enemy coastlines for weeks, its Hellcat umbrella making it essentially invulnerable to air attack. The Japanese could see American carriers on their horizon, knew where they were, but couldn't effectively attack them. The Hellcats would intercept every raid, guided by radar, controlled by fighter direction, flown by increasingly experienced pilots. September 2nd, 1945. Tokyo Bay, USS Missouri. As Japanese officials signed the instrument of surrender, F6F Hellcats from USS Yorktown flew combat air patrol overhead, a final symbol of the aircraft that had helped bring Japan to this moment. Lieutenant Commander Saburo Sakai, who had laughed at intelligence reports about the Hellcat 2 years earlier, watched the surrender ceremony from the Japanese delegation area. In his autobiography, written decades later, he reflected on that moment. I watched American Hellcats circling above the surrender ceremony and felt no anger, only recognition of reality. They had laughed at us for building light fighters without armor. We had laughed at them for building heavy fighters with too much protection. Both sides were right about the other's weaknesses. But only one side built their fighter for the type of war that actually happened. He continued, the Zero was a perfect weapon for the war we imagined. Individual combat between skilled warriors. The Hellcat was a perfect weapon for the war that existed. Mass combat with a side with better systems, better production, and better survival rates would eventually win. We brought swords to a gunfight and wondered why we lost. The final statistics told the story with brutal clarity. F6F Hellcat. Production: 12,275 aircraft in 30 months. Kill ratio: 19.3 to 1. Aces created: 305. Percentage of Navy kills: 75%. Average pilot experience by 1945: 300 plus hours plus combat experience. A 6M0. Production 1943 to 1945. Approximately 6,000 aircraft. Kill ratio by 1945. Approximately 2 to 1 and declining. Aces remaining by August 1945. Fewer than 10 still flying combat. Percentage of pilots with pre-war training by 1945, less than 5%. Average pilot experience by 1945, 40 to 50 hours, no combat experience. The Japanese had laughed at the F6F Hellcat because they didn't understand it represented not just an aircraft, but an entire civilization's approach to war. They saw its weight as weakness, not recognizing that every extra pound represented the strength of an industrial democracy that could afford to protect its warriors. They saw its refusal to turn fight as cowardice, not recognizing it as tactical sophistication that made their primary advantage irrelevant. By the time they understood what the Hellcat represented, their laughter had turned to last letters home, their mockery to kamikaze missions, their confidence to complete collapse. Admiral Saburo Sakai, who had commanded the Japanese fleet at the Philippine Sea, provided perhaps the most honest assessment. We laughed at the Hellcat because we didn't understand that it represented not just an aircraft, but an entire civilization's approach to war. By the time we stopped laughing, our air forces had ceased to exist. The F6F Hellcat entered service weighing twice what the Zero weighed, carrying armor the Zero didn't have, powered by an engine the Japanese couldn't build, armed with weapons they couldn't match, guided by radars they couldn't detect, flown by pilots they couldn't equal in training, and produced in numbers they couldn't comprehend. Japanese pilots had laughed at it because they didn't understand that every extra pound represented not weakness, but the strength of an industrial democracy that could afford to protect its warriors, that every tactical decision that seemed conservative was actually sophisticated understanding of modern air combat, that every system integration that seemed complex was actually force multiplication that made average pilot effective and good pilots devastating. The Hellcat hadn't just defeated the Zero. It had destroyed an entire philosophy of warfare, proving that in modern combat, the nation that could build a better system would destroy the nation that could only build better individual warriors. The Japanese pilots had laughed at the F6F Hellcat. The Hellcat had the last laugh. It always did.